So, what I'm going to try and do the next kind of 20 minutes or so is talk through some of the key terms and terminology that Bernard Stiegler mobilizes to talk about the digital age, digital technologies, social media, etc. So the kind of terms that I'm going to use, this is kind of sometimes referred to as Stiegler speak. It has a very particular way of using terminology, which can be a little bit off-putting at the beginning, but the two terms I'm going to really unpack a little bit this evening. The first term is pharmacology, and the second term is organology. The two terms are kind of linked together. Okay. So I'm going to try and go through step by step, and as I said to Jenny, I don't mind if we finish up in 25 minutes or 20 minutes and then we have a Q&A. I kind of prefer that, because I know that this material is quite dense. Okay. So Bernard Stiegler has come to prominence over the last 10 to 15 years in cultural studies and media studies, and this is in particular because of a book, a 3-volume book that he published called Techniques in Time. And in Techniques in Time, we have an analysis of the cinema which looks at the cinema as a notion of as a temporal object, and through that he begins to mobilize the terms I'm talking about, organology and pharmacology. His influence is kind of gaining momentum at the moment, particularly in media studies. His recent works, he's a very prolific writer. He writes about 2 books a year. This year he's published a book in French in January called La Société Automatique, so the Automatic Society, Volume 1. And after the summer he's going to publish a second volume, which is La Société Automatique, Volume 2, which looks at knowledge. Before that, in 2012, he published a book called De la pharmacologie positive, positive pharmacology, which has just been translated. After that, in 2013, again in 2012, 2013, he published a book called De la pharmacologie du Front National, which is also recently been translated, which is the pharmacology of the National Front. And even in those titles, you can see that his concerns are shifting sometimes towards political issues which are happening in France at the moment. And he links that analysis, for example, with the rise of the National Front in France to what he calls the disenfranchised. And the disenfranchised he will link also to contemporary aesthetics. So it's an aesthetics which is profoundly political and influenced by politics. Okay. So what I'm going to focus on for a few minutes is the first term, which is pharmacology. Now, the backstory to this is that Bernard Stiegler was one of Jacques Derrida's PhD students. And again, the backstory to that is that Bernard Stiegler was in prison for 7 years. He was arrested for armed robbery. He had a jazz bar in Toulouse. He ran into difficulties and cash flow problems. He crossed the road, robbed the bank. Okay. He did it 3 times, and the 3rd time he was caught. Okay. So he was put in prison for 7 years. Now, one of the things that's kind of not really known is that in France, when you are in prison, you have the right to education. And where I worked in the University of Paris 7 for about 15 years, as part of your timetable, you could be asked to teach in the local prison. Okay, so Stiegler began to study philosophy in prison. He's written really fabulous analysis of a kind of a phenomenology of what it's like, what time is like in prison, what space is like in prison, and during that process, he came in contact with Derrida, and Derrida supervised his PhD. And Derrida is the person who actually signed his release forms to let him get out of prison early. Now the backstory to that is when you look at Techniques in Time is basically Bernard Stiegler's thesis, which is rewritten in a 3-volume book form. And in it you're going to see that, particularly in volume 3, which I brought with me, you can see them, which looks at the cinema, you're going to see within that Stiegler starts to critique Derrida's project of deconstruction, and in particular he begins to critique Derrida's understanding of what the pharmacon is. The pharmacon is a term which is very important in the development of Jacques Derrida's philosophy. There's a text called the Pharmacie de Platon, Plato's Pharmacy, from 1968, and in this text, which is about 75 pages long, what we get in Derrida is a shift from his earlier project of what he calls grammatology to the project of deconstruction. That's where, this is a key moment within Derrida's philosophy. This is where we get the development of the whole project of deconstruction comes from this text. It's a text which has been well worn. I mean, everybody, it's been written about since 1968, basically. And if you're interested, I mean, there's a number of critiques of it. One of the ones that I'm particularly interested in is in Paul Ricoeur's text, History, Memory and Forgetting, I think it is in English. When you look at the chapter on the notion of the pharmacon within Ricoeur's text, you get a very, very fine critique of the same problematic that Stiegler is raising. Okay, now, I just might put up a quotation and come back to it. So this is a very famous quotation from Plato. So now I'm going to try and explain this as briefly as I can. So in Derrida's text, Plato's Pharmacy, Derrida gives a critique of Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus. Okay. Now, in the Phaedrus, we have a critique of writing that's given by Plato. So the story is Plato and Phaedrus walk outside the city walls of Athens, they kind of climb a little hill, and Phaedrus has under his cloak a discourse about love, and he tries to remember this discourse, and he's kind of looking under his cloak saying, you know, this is what the discourse said, and Plato kind of catches him out and says, well, that's not your discourse, that's somebody else's discourse, and you've kind of hidden that text. Okay. Now from that, we get an analysis of writing by Socrates, this is the quotation here. We get an analysis of writing as a form of pharmacon. That's where the word comes from. Right? So what he says is that the fact that this invention, writing, will produce forgetfulness in the souls of those who have learned it, because they will not be able to exercise their memories. Being able to rely on what is written, using the stimulus of external marks that are alien to themselves rather than from within, their own innate powers to call things to mind. It's not a remedy for memory, but for reminding that you've discovered. Now the word remedy in this English translation, I think I have it in Greek as well. The word remedy here in the original Greek is pharmakon. So writing is not a cure, a remedy for forgetfulness, but for reminding. So what he means by that is that the pharmakon, writing, is a form of regurgitation. Like I have my text here, So I'm regurgitating something which happened previously. So it's not true memory, it's a form of reminding. So within Socrates' analysis, that means that the pharmacon is a cure and a poison at the same time. It's a cure because it enables me to remember my thoughts that I had previously, but it's a toxic poison because it enables me to forget. Now, in Derrida's text, the Pharmacie de Platon, what you get is a whole list of polysemic possible meanings for remedy, for poison, for cure, for toxin. That's how Derrida plays it out. Now, the key point here is that for Derrida, the pharmacon, because it has the meaning of cure and poison, is an example of what the whole project of deconstruction will be. So we have a naive tendency to think that words have fixed meanings, and what Derrida shows is that each one of those fixed meanings is based upon some type of binary opposition between cure and poison, male, female, etc. And that's what the project of deconstruction, at the beginning, that's what it will be about. Okay. So, the pharmacon is a cure and a poison at the same time. Writing for Socrates, Plato, put it that way, is an example of a techne. He refers to it as a techne. So that is a form of technology in itself. So writing becomes, for Stiegler, an example of what technology is. Now, the way that I often explain this, and if there's people there, I'm sorry if it's a repetition for some people in the room, the way I often explain this is that we have mnemonic technologies, mobile phones, laptops, etc., which become placeholders for memory, like writing. Okay. So when I lose my mobile phone today, my smartphone today, it's not just a communication device, it is a stockholder, a placeholder for memory. Okay. You know, the example I often give is that somebody asks me for my home telephone number, you know, and I didn't know what it was, because on my smartphone it says home. Okay. So that's an example of how digital technologies function as this form of pharmacology. They're placeholders for memory, but they're also placeholders for forgetfulness at the same time. Okay. Now, there's a little kind of subtle difference here, which I'm going to explain for a second. The distinction that Plato, Socrates is making between hypnomnesis, this form of reminding, and anamnesis, which is memory, is a crucial distinction that Stiegler is going to develop. Okay? So, writing is a form of reminding, okay, which is hypnomnesis, and for Plato, that's not what true memory is. For Plato, true memory is anamnesis. For Plato, we have fallen from the world of ideal forms. The world that we live in is the world of the shadow, the world of the cave, and what we have are kind of forms of remembering true forms, true anamnesis, and not hypnomnesis. So there is a kind of a play on this, which I'm going to explain. It's perfectly timed. I haven't even got into. The problem with this, I don't know if you know this book by Nicholas Carr. Nicholas Carr came to, about 3 years ago, 4 years ago. He wrote a text, an article called Why Google is Making Us Stupid. And then he wrote this book called What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, The Shadows. Does anybody know this text? It's a very easy read. What Nicholas Carr points to is that there are forms of reading that takes place with digital technologies, okay, which lead to a form of surface reading of the text. So he gives a kind of very personal account, you know, something that we all experience. You know, I've got 17 PDFs open at the same time. I actually haven't read any of the articles properly. I'm just skimming from screen to screen. And what Nicholas Carr tries to point out is that this form of digital reading that takes place leads to a form of surface reading of the text, and not a profound lexical or comprehension of the text. So here, what we have is the first invention, we could say, is writing. Then we have the printing press, and then we have digital technologies. But what Nicholas Carr points to is that this form of digital representation of the text on screen leads to a form of surface reading of the text. Okay. There's lots of issues with this particular book, particularly the types of research that he points towards in neuropsychology around digital reading, but I'm just going to park that for a second. We'll just take it as kind of accepted that what we're talking about is a form of technology reading on screen, which there is an argument that this is a form of surface reading of the text and not a profound reading of the text. Okay. Now, what Bernard Stiegler is going to do is he's going to take Nicholas Carr's analysis and he's going to develop it much further to show that here again we have an example of a form of pharmacology, which is the digital text. So, on the one hand, we could think of computational linguistic analysis, textual analysis, which has been enabled by specific types of algorithms which have led to the explosion of written forms on the web, but at the same time, that form of technology has led to a form of surface reading. So here again we have this binary between cure and poison within the digital text themselves. Okay. Now, what I wanted to do is go back to then we have another book there, The Dumbest Generation. You get the idea. That's Stiegler's book. Okay, so this slide here now. So the next, so that's a kind of an overall explanation of what Stiegler is mobilizing when he talks about pharmacology. And you can look his most recent publications. There's lots and lots and lots written about this. I'm going to park one bit, and I'll come back to it in a second. The bit I'm going to park is that in Derrida's analysis, although he starts out with cure and poison, it's over the text. If you read it, it's about 75 pages long. The curative bit, the cure bit, just seems to get lost. So Derrida kind of more focuses in his text on the negative aspects of the pharma. We'll park that one. I'll go back in a second. So the next term that Stiegler uses is the term organology. Now, the reason why I was thinking, how could I represent what organology is for you this evening? I said, okay, we'll take an image. So one meaning of the term organology is the study of musical instruments. Okay. How, over time, musical instruments have evolved, developed, etc. Okay. The second meaning for organology tends to relate to living organisms, how living organisms change, mutate over time. And just on that, Stiegler's most recent work, he gave a Skype conference here with us in Dublin 2 weeks ago, and what he's talking about at the moment is notions of entropy and negentropy, so that also leads into forms of organology. So entropy is a form of dissipation of energy, etc. Now, so for the term organology, one of the basic meanings is the history of the study of musical instruments, and within that we have the relationship between, if you wish, man and the machine also. We have a relationship between expression and musical instruments over time. That's what organology is. But for Stiegler, he is going to rely on another tradition, okay? In French philosophy, the philosopher's name is Gilbert Simondon, very kind of not really well known. He wrote a fantastic book. He died very young, He wrote a fantastic book called Mode d'existence des objets techniques, which is the mode of existence of technical objects in 1955-56. And within Simondon's analysis, what we have is a relationship to technology, which sees technology as a process of humanization. We become human through technologies. Okay, so what he says, what Simondon says, is that basically we do not become man without this process of mediation in the world that takes place through technology. Okay, unfortunately, the book has never really been translated properly into English. If you go online, there's half of the book has been translated by an MA student in Canada about 7 years ago, and that's freely available online. It's a very interesting read. It's actually very accessible. Okay? A lot of Simondon's work is not accessible, very readable, whereas this particular book is. Okay? So within it, Simondon is going to develop certain notions of organology, which Stiegler is going to develop. So, for Stiegler, the history of aesthetics and the history of the philosophy of art is based on a series of disadjustments that take place over time. The first one is the body as physiology. The second one is artificial organs, techniques, objects, tools, instruments, works of art. And the third one is social organization. So for Stiegler, he's going to use the term organology for these three different categories. So the first category is the development of the physiology of the body. And here he looks at traditions within French anthropology, particularly the work of Organology and Bratton. So what we get in French anthropology is the notion of the digit, or our fingers. So as we evolve over time and move from Neanderthal to Homo sapien, etc., what we get is the development of forms of physiology, forms of the body, such as the digit. That's one form of organology. The second form of organology is the techniques, tools, artifacts, works of art that we develop. And here we have something which is essential to Stiegler, is the notion of prosthesis. So for Stiegler, he uses expressions like the faux de l'origine, so the original fault, the fault of the origin. So his argument is that we are incomplete without forms of technology. The technology, the prostheses themselves are ways that we complete ourselves in the world. They're not separate to us, they are projects. So technology is seen as something which is creating processes of harmonization, not something which is separate to it. Okay? So the third form, which is social organization, for Stiegler, that's a form of organology. And here, some of the examples that I would refer to are things like participatory performance art, participatory art, durational performance art, where we have the notion of the work of art, which is something which is a form of social organization. Unfortunately, and I've written about this elsewhere, Stiegler chooses Joseph Beuys as the example of social sculpture, the example of participation, whereas I would argue that's slightly problematic. What Beuys's understanding of participation is, I think, is quite different to what Stiegler is trying to organize. Okay? I don't know how much you want to add to it. Okay, so there are the two big terms: pharmacology, organology. Okay, so organology becomes the study of how, over time, we have developed in terms of our own physiology, in terms of the techniques that we use, and in terms of our social organization. And within that, we have a particular term that Stiegler is going to use, which is epiphylogenesis, that is like the study of the development of prosthesis. It's like a genealogical study of how, over time, we have developed different forms of technology, different forms of techniques, which complete who we are. And within that, he would actually include works of art within that analysis. Okay. So then, organology then becomes the history of incarnated material processes which express the sensibility of the singularity of the individual. So organology are forms of how we mediate ourselves in the world, incarnated in the world, but also are part and parcel of our process of becoming individuals. So here the term that's being referred to is a form of individuation. Okay, I always have too many slides. Yeah, right. So here, this spiral drawing, this is taken from a very short text that Stiegler published with Elia in, I think it was 2012. So here we have a diagram of what Stiegler understands by a process of individuation in the world. So the process of individuating is how you become an individual. It's a classic problem in Western philosophy which goes back to Aristotle. So how do I become individuated? How do I become singular? How do I become different to the other? So the process of acting out is a process of emotion, that is movement, a question of motion. There's potential within the recipient of a work, a potential that is work, if it actually works and releases. So here, what Stiegler is referring to is when, philosophically, when I look at a work of art, if I look at some of the material around here this evening, I have a process of individuating, becoming singular in myself, in how I interact with that work of art. So one simple way of putting it is, I will not be the same after having looked at the work of art. It's a process of me becoming different and individual, singular in the world, which is related to my interaction with artworks. So this kind of spiraling that Stiegler has in this diagram is a process whereby it's nearly like, in some ways you can think of it as kind of nearly like a research action process. There's reflection, action, reflection, action. It's how I interact with the world, how I become individual. Then, in this one here, that's why I said there's lots of Stiegler speak. This diagram here is an example of what, it's a diagram of what Stiegler refers to as trans-individuation. So this is like a group of individuals individuating together. Okay? And he calls it, the technical term he uses is an epoch. Right? So the process of becoming human is my process of becoming individuated and singular in the world. Now, I'm going to cut this briefly off now. So what Stiegler argues is that the digital technologies that we use, for example, digital reading, to give that example, these processes actually interrupt that mechanism of individuation and trans-individuation, what he calls short-circuiting the processes. Okay? So instead of the argument would be, you have to be careful here, but the argument would be that digital technologies in one way interrupt that process of individuating in the world. The final point I'm going to make, and I'm going to stop, there's a distinction that Stiegler makes between what he calls the digital age and other ages, which I'm going to explain. Within the philosophy of phenomenology, which goes back to Edmund Husserl, Edmund Husserl explains that we have different forms of attention and protension in the world. So primary intention or primary attention for Husserl is the moment of the present now. Okay, so it's like my perception of the world, if you wish. Okay, that's a form of primary retention or attention, and for Husserl, that can be things that call for you to attend. Now, the interesting thing about the aesthetic object for Husserl, and for Stiegler afterwards, is that the aesthetic object is something which calls on me to attend to it in a very specific way. Okay. primary attention retention is this process of perception of the world. Secondary retention for Searle is my imagination, so I remember. For example, I can remember music that I listened to yesterday. It's a form of secondary attention in the world. Stiegler is going to say that digital technologies are a form of tertiary retention, a third form of retention. Okay? Because digital technologies themselves become these placeholders for memory in themselves. So it's no longer, when I look at my laptop is full of different forms of memory which are held within the object itself in a very different way to other objects. Okay? You can think of Facebook, you can think of any of the digital technologies as a form of placing my memory of who I am within these technologies, which is outside of myself. And that distinction, what he refers to as tertiary retention, that tertiary retention is something which leads to a disruption of the process of individuation. The final point I'm going to make is that I did say that Derrida tended in that text to emphasize the negative aspects of the pharmacon as a toxic poison, etc. The most recent projects of Bernard Stiegler are to do with what he calls a positive pharmacology. So positive pharmacology is to be able to, what he calls, reharness digital technologies in new ways, okay, which promote philosophically reflection. Okay. Now to do that, he set up a very big network. I'm going to skip through. So in 2012, he launched something called Digital Studies. So Digital Studies is an international network of people goes from CalArts to Durham, Cambridge, Humboldt in Germany. So it's a group of people who are involved in investigating the impacts of digital technologies on aesthetics. That's the piece that I'm interested in. But also on epistemology. So the Digital Studies Network is a network whereby disciplines, for example, come together. There was a very good conference last December just gone, where we had astrophysicists, chemists, biologists, people from very different disciplines. And the topic of discussion was how digital technologies themselves have impacted on the construction of knowledge within the disciplines themselves. So the overarching thematic is that what we need to do is understand how digital technologies are impacting on the construction of knowledge so that we can reharness, or what he calls therapeutics, we can mobilize a form of positive pharmacology to reharness the technologies in a different way. And I'm going to stop there. There's a whole piece that I didn't mention, which is to do with a critique of the creative and cultural industries and his critique of the Frankfurt School. To put it quite simply, his critique of the Frankfurt School is that they didn't understand the impact that these tertiary technologies, these tertiary retention technologies were going to have. Okay, there was a kind of, they didn't see, according to Stiegler, Adorno didn't see that there's going to be an explosion of these forms of technologies, and that's the piece that's missing. Okay. I think I've said more now. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if you want, we can invite some questions now, maybe for about 5 minutes, if anyone wants to ask Noel about
anything you wish. About anything.
Just going back to your point about, or I guess quoting Stiegler's point about digital technology as a sort of short circuit individuation. Just grappling with that, it seems almost counterintuitive given how much of digital technology is focused on the expression of the self.
Yeah.
Like we're given more and more avenues to express ourselves as we see ourselves.
Yeah.
and almost idealized forms of ourselves. So is that in itself not a form of individuation? Or do you think we're having the work taken away from us? Is that the idea?
Yeah, but I suppose what I was trying to, that's a very good question, okay? There is, I suppose let's take one example that might help, right? For Stiegler, and I would agree with this, the difficulty sometimes is forms of monetization that take place, okay? That the presentation of the self, for example, within something like Facebook, is something that is used in a very particular way, and the crumbs that we leave across who we click on and what we like becomes a form of an industry in itself. And there's a very good analysis of Google, because I worked a lot on computation linguistics. Kind of very interesting term which Frederick Kaplan from the University of Zurich writes about. He calls it linguistic capitalism. Okay. What he means by linguistic capitalism is that in one way, words themselves have become things which can be monetized. So to get up your search engine optimization, we buy and sell the words we use. So my response to the question is, in one way, yes, they are forms of individuation. There's no doubt about that. But it's how those forms of individuation are being harnessed for different things. Another term that Stiegler refers to is an economy of attention. And something that I'm very interested in, that we are constantly, our attention is being captivated and captured in specific ways. That we're constantly called to attend to different things, and in that process of attention we have a form of monetization that takes place of that attention. So again, that notion of short-circuiting individuation, instead of having longer processes of individuation in the world, where we get a kind of what he refers to as kind of shortcuts. So my individuation, yes, through Facebook does take place, but it takes place in a very kind of short-circuited way, which is being monetized. Actually, he has a book at the moment that he's writing about Facebook. How to be my friend.
If we were to look at the two terms, pharmacology and organology, is there, I know you've chosen those to talk about today, but is there a way of either making a distinction or a connection where the pharmacon is this kind of insert problem and cure, and then organology is more like the extra stuff or some kind of production through technology? Like, is there?
Yeah, there is kind of, it's a very good question, because it's sometimes what happens in the way that Stiegler writes, it becomes very circular. Okay, so what you get are kind of references to organology, pharmacology. It all kind of seems to spin around itself. Whereas more recently, what I've come to understand is that if we see that organology is this kind of general process of how we mediate ourselves in the world, in general, okay, whether it's physiological, artifact, social organization, and then pharmacology in particular looks at the processes within the artifact, which is within that process of organology, if that makes sense. It's like, that's one way to think about it. Organology is like this umbrella process that we're in, and pharmacology is one aspect of it.
Hi everyone, it's Benjamin Bratton in my office in La Jolla in California. Very sorry that I won't be able to join you this time in Dublin, though hope to very soon. I'm on my way to another conference in Budapest that I had accepted an invitation to earlier, though I would, given the choice, I would rather have been with you guys in Dublin, so I hope that I can very soon. The talk that I prepared for today has to do with the future of the stack, and particularly the cloud layer. And for those who are not familiar with my work on this, the stack refers to the totality of planetary scale computation, such that instead of seeing these varieties of computing, cloud computing, smart cities, Internet of Things, and so forth, as a bunch of different species of computing all spinning off on their own, we can in fact understand them as forming a kind of, at least as a model, a kind of coherent totality, not unlike a software and hardware stack. And in the model that I discuss in the upcoming book from MIT Press coming out this fall, that model is 6 layers: Earth layer, cloud layer, city layer, an address layer, an interface layer, and a user layer. And today I would like to talk, the talk to some extent comes from the conclusion chapter of the book, which is about the potential future of each of these layers, or at least some ideas as to what the critical variables are that will determine that. And so I'll begin on the future of the cloud layer to come. I mean, before I do, one thing about I think a key idea to understand around the idea of the stack is that it's a model for infrastructure that is understood to be intrinsically modular. The reason that hardware and software stacks are able to incorporate unanticipated and unanticipatable innovations is that as long as something, you can put a completely new technology into any layer, and so long as it abides by the protocols that decide how that particular layer is supposed to communicate with the layer above and below it, it can be anything. And so perhaps the good news aspect of the stack as a model is that the stack that we have is almost inevitably not the stack that we will have, and that it is there to be replaced in situ by new forms. And that, I argue, is in many ways, one of the core design challenges, philosophical challenges, and political challenges of our moment, is to articulate the stack to come. On the cloud layer to come, what I'll talk a little bit about is perhaps a somewhat more pessimistic scenario, but also talk about even inside this scenario, perhaps the way forward and the way out is already is already available to us. So I'll begin. The ground zero of robotic automation may be in California, but a few hundred miles south and east of Silicon Valley, in the San Joaquin Valley, where 1% of the U.S. farmland produces 8% of its agricultural output, generating at least $36 billion for the state and over $100 billion in related economic activity. The area is the engine that makes California the 5th largest supplier of food in the world, and its capital is the crestfallen metropolis of Fresno, population 500,000. Fresno, with a Z as it is known, often comes near last in urban quality of life polls, and even a quick visit to its flat and sunny, dusty, and plainly mean avenues confirms the results. Roughly a third of all jobs in the city are tied directly to agriculture, which makes the economy particularly vulnerable to downward wage pressures, as well as to climate change-related drought, which during the year of this book's writing have been both severe. The pressures of increased efficiencies against crop losses, toward crop diversity and speed of delivery, make agriculture an important area for applied robotic automation, picking, sorting, transporting, as well as plant-by-plant drone observation and diagnosis. These factors together nominate Fresno to enjoy first-mover disadvantage in the evolution of similar urban centers toward broadband-dependent manoralism and serfdom, and evacuation, and its economy toward cloud feudalism. Detroit is the first case study we have of what robotics can do to an insufficiently diversified urban system, dependent on intensive assembly labor, but it's certainly not the only one, nor does it represent the inevitable outcome of physical computing as applied to infrastructural scale manufacturing economies. But Fresno may soon take its place alongside. Future scenarios for cloud feudal life in Fresno are mostly grim. Imagine that most remaining jobs are related to servicing the automated logistics and warehousing of food packets, many optically identical to work in an Amazon warehouse or FedEx routing facility, while the surplus population that has not or cannot exit is largely unemployed and increasingly desperate. The cloud is able to treat food, defined here as culturally and economically desirable modules of protein, vitamins, and sugars, as parcels or data packets in a deep supply chain that incorporates local climate, soil, nutrients, seed systems, individual plant care, harvesting, sorting, warehousing, packaging, refrigeration, global destination optimization, as well as the meta-governance of demand modeling, crop diversification, qualitative and quantitative research, and, one hopes as well, the geo-governance of nutrition and food health. This is to say nothing of the multi-story hydroponic megastructures growing onions, orchids, and okra in deep midnight. The intelligent further industrialization of food is potentially in itself an extremely positive, if crucial, anthropogenic strategy. If Heidegger self-servingly compared industrial agriculture to Auschwitz, and today's biofundamentalists sometimes use similar imagery to demonize GMOs, we may prefer instead to see the design of food platforms as less about preserving the experiential simulation of pre-industrial farming and eating, A is for apple, and more like molecular gastronomy at landscape scale, inventing amazing new forms from the calculative slurry. In their seams of leisure, craft farms can be left to those with the time to indulge pornographic fantasies of prelapsarian originalism. That is to say, cloud feudalism is neither desirable nor inevitable, even according to the processes that are trying hard to birth it today. None of this gleaming promise screens out, however, the present reality determined by vastly inequitable relations to the wealth of the Fresno that we have and the Fresno toward which we slouch. In time, cities such as these may not need so many people, but will still have them nevertheless. They may not really be cities so much as city-shaped refugee camps, and like all camps, they are the inverse image of the enclaves that spawn them by inverting lines of geographic demarcation and systemic interfaciality. Those employed, quote-unquote, in Fresno may not even be inside city limits. If we follow the thread of Alex Rivera's film Sleep Dealer, a film in which California's agriculture is served by drone pilot/robot fruit pickers working remotely from behind the sovereign wall separating the United States and Mexico, it is not unreasonable to imagine a further logistic dehumanization of Fresno's on-site population. Perhaps the cost of piloting agricultural labor will be held down by global wage arbitrage, pickers in Tijuana competing with pickers in Jakarta and Juneau to provide fast and cheap results. That is, formal national jurisdiction may have far less to do with the economies of cloud feudalism than it does with which cloud polis, enclave platform, or urban camp counts any given worker as one of its users. The elevation of labor systems like Amazon's Mechanical Turk, TaskRabbit, and Uber to infrastructural scale suggests several paradoxical and even contradictory outcomes, both positive and negative. One of these is well summarized as, I'm really looking forward to a future in which service employees are leased Google Glass so they can compete courses for in-profit trade schools while simultaneously earning healthcare vouchers instead of actual currency and Soylent instead of actual food. We should add, however, that the lease terms on that glass set are conditional on whether or not the user actually won that bid to pick avocados. Cloud feudalism can be understood then as a particular distribution of power between central commanding platform servers and quasi-autonomous, if relatively powerless, network clients as applied to human economic geography. Several have articulated the problems associated with these sorts of arrangements, their impact on demand-side growth, and their ultimate macroeconomic instability. Under such regimes, platform economics works to monopolize power and wealth into centripetal consolidations of extracted value. The ratio of value realized by those users who collaborate with platform commons, called user platform value, to those whose claims on infrastructural profits, platform surplus value, is grotesquely misaligned. For political dispositions across the ideological spectrum, The supposed solution is making freedom of personal autonomy from platforms more absolute, up to and including generalized secession. From one side we hear, the main achievement, quote, the main achievement of the nation state in the last century has been the establishment of a uniform grid of heavily policed barriers across the world. Given a free movement of people, the whole neoliberal project would collapse, unquote. From the other side, quote, if you value freedom, then I think that exit comes out way ahead of voice as a mechanism by which people can express their preferences, unquote. Under some real-world situations, the hard partition, keeping people in or keeping people out, is given sovereign status, especially its surface, imbued with maximal gateway intelligence. And in others, the elective coordination of free market actors and agents is seen as a proliferation of modular desiring machines, like a North Korean stadium pageant without an actual country behind it. All decisions linked instead by an ontological proletariat writing the rules of proprietary semantic webs. If everyone, in principle, has the right of exit to opt out of their citizenship, end user agreement for another platform offered elsewhere, but all the good spots have already been taken by high-end cloud polities that feature strong exclusionary membership bylaws, keeping the plurality of humans at bay, then the difference between state violence on the border and posted rules of a gated community, that is, between positive and negative freedom, essentially, are dark and bitter comedy. Nation states, in this regard, nation states can be read in relation to these, strongly or weakly, writing themselves on the earth as petroglyphs, writing themselves in law. They are keen to concretize the integrity of virtual boundaries when ingress and egress are seen to compromise asymmetries of power between zones of a synthetic landscape of loops and bubbles. Enclaves, exclaves, and especially colonies drew another jigsaw on top of the first, nonlinear and non-contiguous outlines of sovereign control and rule. At various times, this becomes a momentum for jurisdictional integration, as for the American colonies in the 1770s, the EU in the 1990s, Italy and Germany in the 19th century, and at other times, an equal momentum for disintegration, as for the USA in the 1860s, India and Pakistan in the 1950s, USSR in the same 1990s, and seemingly everywhere today. It takes different forms and seeks different ends. Schemes to break up California would mean political autonomy for Silicon Valley and several more Senate seats, special economic zones freeing up markets for commodity assemblage by keeping hands and fingers on call in special factory camps, sovereign wealth funds turning states into corporate actors, Supreme Court rulings truing corporate actors into holders of religious and political speech rights, neo-Confederates once again taking control of one of the USA's major political parties, Saudi Arabia buying sovereign farmland in Indonesia to secure its food future, the hard geopolitics of ongoing state-sponsored spying, hacking, and mutual recriminations, and so on. You probably have your own roster of examples as well. And so the great migrations, psychodemographic segmentations, and biopolitical wall building is not always about claiming more and more zero-sum territory at the expense of rivals. Sometimes it means the opposite, even deliberately shrinking domains of sovereign interest. Australia recently relinquished its claim on a nearby island so it would not have to take responsibility for refugees who landed there, hoping to gain admittance to the Australian jurisdictional protections. However, the logics of generalized secession are not interoperable with one another in the same way that the Westphalian state platform for political consolidation made the form and formats of states similar and compatible. Instead, according to the strange mathematical pressures of combination and separation, integration and disintegration, bull markets in both non-polarity and hyperpolarity collaborate to assassinate unipolar geopolitical architectures. Many of those who engineer these platforms are not only aware of these architectures of proto-sovereignty, they anxiously evangelize them. sometimes ingeniously, sometimes awkwardly, and sometimes idiotically. Demonstrating all three of these in various measure, venture capitalist Vishal Shrivastava summarized the rationale of secession in his internet-famous speech, Silicon Valley's Ultimate Exit. His address is worth examining for what it clarifies about the current state of thinking on cloud polos, about what is so strikingly inadequate about the discourse itself, and how it was received and misunderstood. Shrivastava's key points were that the loci of 20th century American power in governance, media, finance, entertainment, education, military, giving way to a new economic system based in Silicon Valley software, but that the old order will inevitably defend its flagging legitimacy by blaming software macroeconomics for the world's problems. He argues that the best remedy is to allow for free zones in which a, quote, world run by Silicon Valley could be tried and tested and demonstrated without interference for all to observe. Quote, we need to run the experiment to show what a society run by Silicon Valley looks like without affecting anyone who wants to live inside the paper belt, as he calls it. The inevitable success of this new polity would make it obvious that it is the sovereign platform of choice for anyone clear-minded enough to care. For this, he argues, the essential criteria of liberty is the right to withdraw from unworkable regimes. Without naming the source, he draws on the thesis of Albert Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, Responses to Decline in Firms, Organizations, and States, from 1970, which addresses remedies available to consumers and citizens in the face of deteriorating quality of goods and services, including, for example, a failed and repressive state. Voice is the right to petition or reform institutions to which one belongs, and exit is the right to get up and go, to emigrate, to change teams, to start anew. Addressing the diverse audience, Shrivastava says, I would bet that exit is a reason why half of this audience is alive. Many of us have ancestors who came from China, Vietnam, Korea, Iran, places where there's war or famine, economic basket cases. Exit is something that I believe we need to preserve, and exit is what this talk is about, unquote. He compares states and cloud platforms directly and quickly asks us to evaluate one like the other. Is the United States the Microsoft of nations, he asks to an audience for whom Microsoft represents everything old, inflexible, arbitrary, poorly designed, coercive, monolithic, and unfortunate about large platforms. Just as progress in the cloud depends on the user's ability to opt out of one platform and opt into another that provides more robust, trustworthy, and well-designed services, doesn't the same apply to governing platforms called states, he asks. Leaving iOS for Android does not involve navigating the armed guards of the Berlin Wall or walking across the Sonoran Desert, as of now. So why can't movement between platforms of political sovereignty work the same way? We note that he does not articulate the convergence of cloud platforms absorbing traditional functions of the state, as states meanwhile rotate into cloud platforms. That convergence may confirm or undermine the argument about the necessary superiority of one over the other. The more sophisticated point he makes, almost offhandedly, is one that does not require the geographic region of Silicon Valley to shift jurisdictional profile at all. That's the thing about exit. You can take as much or as little of it as you want. You don't have to actually go and get your own island. You can do the equivalent of dual booting or telecommuting. You can opt out, exit at whatever level you prefer. Now, especially if we take level to correspond weakly or strongly to the layers of the stack, he is correct, but is seemingly unaware of the cascading implications of this observation. Different users might initiate columns up and down the stack from different positions and will be interpolated by the geoscopic interests of different interfaces, will make use of what those interests are able to address, will be situated within interfacial envelopes of a given city, variously interiorizing and exteriorizing his or her location. They will be enrolled in one or more competing cloud platforms of various interoperability and activated by supporting energy systems, both physical and political, of the earth layers. Different users will have different columns available and unavailable to them by definition, according to the determinate strength of one or more of the governing layers activated. The city layers of Pyongyang and Palo Alto will curtail or enable such very different possibilities for the other layers in the stack that the city layer may, in this case, have final leverage over the others. Or in a perfectly walled garden, the platform coherence of the cloud layer may be so close and perfected that the interface layer and the address or user layer are decided with a very small margin of variance. That is, for any real column up and down the stack, there's a range between the strong incorporation of the sovereign operations of all layers together into one complete vertical system and the strong modularity of the layers into separate and counter-programmable components. That range is not equally distributed to all users, and most important variations may be possible for some users and not for others. And so exit is never available equally to and from all platform users. Now, for the real geo-design initiative that we all have before us, the important pressure point then is that the sovereign operations of any one layer of the stack is not necessarily reducible or even interoperable with the others, and that redesigning, reprogramming, re-legislating, re-articulating the sovereign techniques of the layers can directly affect the others and shift the relative leverage between them. There's nothing inevitable about any one tilt, but the recombinant logic of stack platforms allows in principle for the future replacement and displacement of the machinery of one layer. Furthermore, as the activation of a column occurs up and down all the layers of the stack from wherever a user may be physically located, the reformation of the sovereign qualities of any one layer may reverberate up to users across the world from and to one another, but because they are located differently, the ultimate effects of that reverberation will not be uniform. As both activate that reprogram layer, one user may be opting out, while another user may be opting in, even as their gestures appear identical. What is up for one may be down for another. What is exit for one may be entrance for another. As a user initiates multiple columns over time, all of us do, even simultaneously, she may be inside the sovereign terms of one layer, say a cloud platform or the geolocation or IP address, while simultaneously inside those same layers as the user of another column in another stack. That is, the political interpolation of the user never finally resolves into the biography of one single person in the same way that the identity of the citizen did and does. The management of multiple user identities and political positions is less psychological disorder than the politics of everyday life. The design of the terms and norms of that irresolvable multiplicity is inseparable from the design of the sovereign characteristics of the stack layers that mediate it. And so the simplistic state versus market metaphysics of mainstream Silicon Valley techno-libertarianism rather undersells the disruptive potential of its own product. The trial balloon of an information technology free zone in principle that Servison discusses, in principle echoes the remarks made in 2013 by Google CEO Larry Page during his Google I/O keynote speech, in which he wondered aloud about a Google island where we, quote, set apart part of the world. I think as technologists we should have some safe places where we can try out new things and figure out the effect on society. What's the effect on people? Without having to deploy it to the whole world, unquote. Page compared his speculative temporary autonomous zone to Burning Man, a city that comes and goes on an annual cycle unlike an actual island, and so of only limited experimental significance and value. Page's thought bubble presents more than a few problems, even taken at face value, perhaps especially taken at face value. Without having to deploy it to the whole world implies that the island is a society-sized laboratory with all the standard measures in place to isolate and contain contaminants from entering or exiting. Accordingly, the testbed can only prototype the ideal software society within its formal boundary if that border is enforced by draconian walls and firewalls. This purified closure would either validate or violate the inspiration for the island as a project, depending on your motivation. If it is not breached and remains a vacuum, then the findings will have diminished significance outside of the artificial environment. if data or some other aspect of the island microsociety were to leak out or in on a regular basis, as happened with Biosphere 2 in the Arizona desert, then the experimental non-interference would be breached to whatever significant or insignificant degree. If breached, then the island is just one locus among many in the whole world. One which may layer experiments one on another in dense concentration, but which does what it does through direct, if filtered, relationships with other enclaves and camps. So by the same measure of Servisson's admonitions, this is a mixed blessing. On the one hand, the rarefied testing grounds must still make use of unprogrammable input from the normal outside, a concession which may disappoint some purists. On the other hand, his strenuous defensive exit, Servisson's that is, must apply even to the utopias to which emigrants relocate, not just to the ones from which they originated. People, data, carbon, air, and capital have to be able to leave Google Island for the principle and narrative to hold true. The only way to have it both ways is to solve for the closed totality of island and then, quote, deploy it to the whole world, where planetary boundaries drawn against space may provide a similar closure as the island draws against the ocean. The inclination towards that information universalism is perhaps more familiar to Google's intellectual project than it is to that of the strong secessionists. Now, there are other future scenarios to spin out from the leverage of this fissure, and they may all really be a more polite way of describing the present from the comfort of a slightly offstage perspective. If formal Westphalian political geography is to be further delinked from last instance sovereignty, we could as easily imagine, if not as easily implement, a situation in which estate services are available to users anywhere, according to their interests and choices, some determined by economic privileges, others by cultural and brand allegiances, others by whether or not they are even humans. As cloud platforms absorb state functions and states realize cloud platforms' topologies and methods, the free soil of the stack does not necessarily privilege either of these in favor of the other. States and clouds platforms may consolidate their competing and complementary services based on different strategies for protocol lock-in. Some geographic, some constitutional, some by historical legacy, some contractual, some extractive, some by taxing premiums, some mere convention. For example, we may draw a scenario in which the European Union or some quasi-state actor, perhaps a religious polity or a cloud platform, offers a far more secure and useful digital identity services than California. And so those of us who are now California residents choose to be part of that platform, instead of, or as well as being Californians at other layers and at other times, and effectively paying taxes to a state other than our own according to the terms of service. In time, people from different locales might become more intertwined with the services and political conflicts of the EU than they are with their home nation, because it is the EU platform that is actually providing them a preferred secure economic and cultural identity, access to transactions, even education and other social services. Perhaps someone can choose to live under the EU's platform's data laws even if they mostly reside in Los Angeles. And perhaps by the terms of data traffic encryption and securitization, mutual non-aggression pact among platforms, no one can or does stop them. Perhaps they don't even give up their USA passports because it doesn't really matter. In this scenario, some platform strategies would rely on interoperability among federated universal networks, maybe Google's, maybe not, while others would contain the advantages and suffer the disadvantages of closed loops, such as Iran's continuously pending halal internet. For our user from California, then, movement is not absolute. Perhaps the greater People's Republican Army services apparatus in China is part of a transnational bloc that, for whatever reason, has been programmed to prevent interoperation with the EU platform. The walled garden topography becomes once again one of antagonistic fiefdoms, based on a fluidity between the positions of various institutional actors that is more agnostic as to the latitude and longitude of users, citizens, clients, and members. The prospect, then, of polities delinking from states, and states from territories, territories from the consumable image of governing platforms, and realigning and recohering, sets in motion various different kinds of realignments and liquefations. Unlike oceans, however, that liquidity does not cover all locations equally. Does universal mobility always also mean that the economies mobilize against the consequences of their meta-transactional externalities, those stored in camps or carbon sinks or landfills and prisons? Some libertarian design fictions run along similar lines, drawing the conclusion that elective self-exclusion will better guarantee a community comprised only of those of the preferred disposition. Freedom is taken to mean a challenge to the state's monopolies on walls and borders, seen as offensive to the principles of personal liberty and mobility, in order to show that new private walls and borders can be developed without the restraints of collective regulation. The economist Robin Hanson wonders aloud about the impending likelihood of individual trillionaires, persons who have encircled so much monetary wealth that they control more than any but the top 15 nation states. For Hanson, this development might be welcome because it would allow for a scale of privately sovereign capital previously unknown to highly technological societies, which could be risked on behalf of globally beneficial megaprojects that would be otherwise impossible. Yes, perhaps it may also instead bring psychotic, incestuous autocracies, which generally have a poor track record. For some, the prospects of running the world through a Sky Club suite of sovereign private lounge services may feel like a tidy substitute for the messy state of things. But for those users without the means to purchase their way in, or whose cognitive labor and attention is deemed not valuable enough to support adequate platform services, they are left exposed to the wilderness beyond the bad walls. This cloud polis model leads away from a heterogeneity of dynamic alternatives and toward a strongly differentiated hierarchy of lived experiences and isolated economies. The scenario casts a vast cognitive biomass, heaving and wheezing, clicking on things, with no privacy or support, curtailed into restricted channels of menial online work, training search and advertising algorithms with their frustrated queries, naming things CAPTCHA-ing blurry images until mealtime. In other words, under the terms of this scenario, the differential capacity of mobility for some is proportional to the immobility of others. For some, the right of exit is paired with a right or ability of entrance to the island platform of their choosing. Whereas for others, exit is a dead option because they are all denied entrance into the closed enclaves that they would choose if they were allowed to do so. Without entrance, exit is not a right, it is a privilege or a product. When exit becomes a privilege, one defined by the suppression of entrance, then it stops being a philosophical principle and starts being a weapon. So why don't I stop there? I indicated to the organizers that I would be happy to continue the conversation with you on Twitter and to help flesh out these scenarios, to define their limits, to clarify any of the points that I've made here as well. And I certainly welcome doing so. As I indicated in the book, the Stack book, I really see it, I see the book as a design brief. I mean, it's a work of political philosophy, architectural theory, software studies, but in the point of trying to provide a model that would describe this totality is so that in doing so, that model would allow for others to leverage it towards defining, deciding, designing, implementing better outcomes. It should be taken as a tool, as something to work with, something to be made use of in whole or in part. And so hopefully some of the chat we can have over Twitter will be one part of that. So my Twitter handle, if it's not, though I'm sure that we distribute to you, is just Bratton, Bratton. And so I look forward to hearing from you. And again, apologize for not being there in person, but I hope to see you all soon. Okay, be well. Bye.
The dominant theme in science fiction film of the last few decades involves the breakdown of the real whereby the existence of a coherent reality itself is problematized. We have films like Dark City, The 13th Floor, obviously The Matrix, films like Avalon, that I was trying to show a clip from, and Existence, all of which highlight the issue of the seamless integration of the virtual and the real, the kind of questioning of, where does the real begin and virtuality end, or vice versa. And David Deutsch, in a book called The Fabric of Reality, has a very interesting chapter on virtual reality, where he is arguing that we create our own virtual reality through the processing of information. So the question of whether we're just all living in a kind of a virtual world that we've created is kind of maps onto the dichotomy between relativism and realism. The question whether there is something beyond the world that I'm constantly creating in my brain from the raw data, or whether that's all there is. So at the end of a film like Existence, for example, you have the suggestion that the characters are hopelessly lost in a world of computer gaming, and perhaps that they have been since the film began. And you have the same in, if you haven't seen these films, they're wonderful. Another film called Avalon, which is a joint Japanese-Polish film by Mamoru Oshii. Again, at the end, the question is raised, whether the characters are still in the virtual world, the game world, or whether they're back in the real world. So, why is it? Why is this stuff kind of interesting? Why does it interest us? Why do we get a frisson of kind of fascinated fear when the question is raised as to whether the persons depicted on the screen are in the real or not. From a psychoanalytical perspective, it could involve a resistance to suture and the momentary freeing of the Lacanian imaginary from the constraints of the symbolic. So, I'm just kind of throwing out that as one kind of possible reason why a lot of us find this stuff kind of interesting. What is the nature of the weird pleasure we take in watching the depicted real slip away from under a depicted character's feet, a character with whom we may in some way identify? So this is where it gets kind of weird, and it's a guy that you may have heard of, an English philosopher, living in England, called Nick Bostrom, and if you look him up in Google, you will come across a lot of stuff where he's questioning whether we actually live in a computer simulation, where that he's raising the question that it may be that it's quite possible, statistically speaking, that we actually live in a computer simulation that has been created by some kind of distant intelligence. This is not kind of weird, Tim foil hat stuff. He's a very respected philosopher. So these kinds of films raise questions about the nature of reality that are also being raised in kind of more mainstream philosophical circles. So another take on this, to get back to the question of the pleasure that these issues impart. And Roland Barthes offers the term jouissance, which is overtones of the erotic, of ecstasy, of the orgasmic, which derives from narratives that don't offer closure. I mean, the thing about the Matrix is there actually is closure. You know at the end, that in the highly unlikely event that anybody here hasn't seen it, and this is a spoiler, that we're all batteries for machines, and we're living in a simulated world. So that kind of maybe is a kind of an aesthetic weakness of the Matrix, because it does give that kind of closure, whereas films like Avalon and Existence don't. They leave it open, and Cronenberg is a wizard at that. He's, even going back to film like Videodrome that was made back in the early 1980s, before the digital revolution took off. He was, at that point, he was still playing around with these kinds of questions about the nature of the real versus the virtual. So Barthes speculates as to the proximity or identity of bliss and fear in terms of the concept of jouissance. So why does this state of epistemological suspension involve a sense of aesthetic pleasure rather than mere terror? And you could maybe cite the old concept, in going back to Burke and Kant, of the sublime in that context. And obviously there are this kind of strong resonances with the writings of Philip K. Dick, who is a genius in terms of the way that his ideas have been managed to be appropriated and making fascinating films, from Minority Report to Gamma Darkly and so on. But this kind of constant trope of the paranoid terror that we are lost in a world of simulation, and that it's impossible to get out of it. So then at that point you could cite a couple of figures in terms of left-wing theory, people like Bratton and Marcuse, and the idea of film as being something, which you get in Godot as well, as being something that helps us see through the myth of depiction, and consequently the myth of reality, or social reality, in the sense of Brecht. So that from a kind of a materialist perspective, you could argue that films that are breaking the notion of reality as depicted in terms of the story depicted on the screen, it might be argued that they can fulfill a possible progressive social function in Bratton terms, because they're helping us see through the illusion of capitalist world that we live in. And that this is one of there's a minor cottage industry developed about when the Matrix came out about 15 years ago, and this was one of the takes on it that you don't see it. They didn't see it so much as a metaphysical or epistemological or ontological inquiry as something that could be seen in potentially progressively political terms. But I would argue that there isn't necessarily a major split between the two. You don't have to kind of categorize yourself either as relativist quietist on the one hand or realist activist on the other. It's possible to be a postmodernist progressive leftist, which I suppose in one way is what I might be described as. So Marcuse cites Freud singling out a fantasy, P-H-A-N-T-A-S-Y, as a mental activity that holds on to a measure of freedom from the reality principle, a principle that Marcuse understands as having attained an oppressive dimension and as being capable of being transcended in a future society in the name of play, freedom, eros, and the aesthetic dimension. So perhaps film that frees us momentarily and in aesthetic terms from bondage to the depicted real, perhaps that also has a potentially progressive political dimension in terms of hinting at a possible world where we are not trammeled so much by the reality principle, the performance principle, the work ethic, this kind of crazy world where you're supposed to want to spend your time doing stuff that you have to be paid to do. This bizarre hypnotism of the work ethic. So maybe films like The Matrix, with their questioning and critique of the depicted reality, and more radically, films like Avalon and Existence can be seen in those kind of potentially liberatory political terms. And it's not an either-or thing. A movie can be have a politically liberatory dimension and also an ontologically undermining dimension. And it's if you go back to Kafka, interpretations of Kafka, I mean, you don't have to interpret Kafka in just an either-or way, but it's either a critique of capitalist bureaucracy on the one hand, or a critic of metaphysical angst and whatever. I mean, it's quite possible to be both. Marcuse believes, and this is a quote, "Behind the aesthetic form lies the repressed harmony of sensuousness and reason, the eternal protest against the organization of life by the logic of domination, the critique of the performance principle." Adorno has been mentioned already, perhaps inevitably at an event like this. Adorno's notion about art in the modern world is that it survives only where it undergoes a process of self-cancellation, denying its traditional form and thereby avoiding a false reconciliation. It becomes surrealistic and atonal. So that's why the best kinds of films of the type that I've been describing are the ones that do indeed avoid a false reconciliation. They avoid closure, they avoid suture, and they open up depicted world in a way which is at the same time scary and also fascinating and potentially perhaps liberating as well. So there's an issue also around the relationship between this kind of film and surrealism. They're not the same as surrealism. In some ways they're the opposite, since they make the natural and believable seem incredible rather than the incredible believable. I'm kind of skipping through this and trying to condense my talk. So anyway, one possible way of understanding the bliss of the unreal is that it offers a glimpse of a possible future or alternative social reality where the aesthetic and the play principle receive free rein in the realm of freedom, a politically almost forgotten possible utopian world of play and creativity, freed from the constraints of the performance principle and to whatever extent from those of the reality principle itself. This is taken on a mind of its own, so I'll just let it play.
Deja Vu.
No.
What did you just say?
Anyway, it's a bit from The Matrix with the black cat. You probably remember it. The cat appears twice, and he raises the question as to, is this there seems to be a kind of an actualization of deja vu. And so, if you wanted to be really paranoid, you could posit the phenomenon of deja vu itself as a glitch in our collective matrix, where the system is just kind of momentarily broken down. So anyway, I mentioned the notion of sublime already, and the dissolution of filmic or literary reality is often accompanied by foreboding or terror. And the sublime is traditionally characterized as a pleasure founded on pain and danger. In Kant's terms, he talks about elements of nature such as thunder, volcanoes and waterfalls. And he says we call these objects sublime because they raise the forces of the soul above the, quote, because they raise the forces of the soul above the height of vulgar commonplace and discover within us the power of resistance of quite another kind, which gives us courage to be able to measure ourselves against the seeming omnipotence of nature. So, there are a few things, probably more terrifying than the notion that we are living in a simulated reality. If you think about it, it's kind of links into the philosophical notion of solipsism, which is that you're all a figment of my imagination, which is impossible to philosophically disprove, but also after a point isn't very philosophically interesting. But nevertheless, considerable artistic gain can be made from the use of the notion. So this kind of challenge to the common consensus as to the nature of reality derives its energy and effect partly perhaps from the aesthetic dimension of the sublime. So, just to wind up, in attempting to understand the aesthetic appeal of some cinema over the last couple of decades, which calls reality itself into question, I've mentioned the Lacanian imaginary, Marcuse's notion adapted from Freud of the liberatory potential of fantasy, and the notion of the sublime. So in the interplay between psychology, politics, aesthetics, and epistemology, the works of popular culture urge themselves upon us for interpretative response. And if you wanted to be really paranoid, you could imagine that some alien intelligence is desperately trying to interfere with my message by screwing up the Wi-Fi system. So on that paranoid note, David, thanks.
Hello, I'm the artist in the old talk, so hopefully okay. I'm going to start off with a quote from Maurice Blanchot from his Infinite Conversation. What has been said one time not only does not cease to be said, but always recommences, and not only recommences, but also imposes upon us the idea that nothing has ever truly begun, having from the beginning begun by beginning again. Jenny's kind of introduced some of my work, but I tend to work in a variety of media, from like sound, print, video, painting, sculpture. It's whatever I find the best way to kind of convey whatever ideas I'm trying to work with. So I don't really have a style, or there's nothing you can kind of say that's it. I tend to, as she said, I use negation, abstraction, and appropriation as strategies to make works. By destabilizing the intended functions of images and images, objects, words, it allows new ways of investigating them. In the last few years, writing and writers have become very important to my practice. The techniques of Kaki Acker, Alan Robgray, Georges Perec, Margarita Jura, Dennis Cooper, along with other literature and experimental poetry, have become very influential. Speaking, I'm interested in the moments where edges blur and ideas around us are ruptured, but this to me is not a failure, it's more a gap where something new is possible. This is Johnny Five from Short Circuit, and it's probably the closest way of kind of finding a portrait of myself. He's always looking for new input, and I'm always looking for new input, finding new ideas. So I tend to take from a lot of different areas, philosophy, writing, sound, music, and they all kind of merge around into my head, and I start trying to make connections, and then works get made from that. So, just go on. My studio is kind of odd for an artist studio, because it's usually just a desk, a laptop, a pile of books, and a printer. The books are the most important. This is a tidy version of the last studio I had, which is in Paris. There's a few works on the wall, but most things are kind of hidden away, because I'm usually living in the space I am, and I don't really want to have to live with my work all the time, because it's the annoying problems of things, and I'm trying to work out stuff, so having to see it constantly is a bit like there's no escape. So I tend to keep things on hard drives and stuff. The studio also has looked like this, where I've had two laptops. This is hiding out in my old bedroom in my parents' house, and I've been kind of travelling. I've been on residencies for the last few years, back and forth in different places. Shall we move on? Okay, this is Glitch. There's two works in this show. There's a video work behind you there, and we'll start with that guy. So this is an attempt. This piece is based on Perec's book, An Attempt at Exhausting a Place in Paris, where he sat and documented what had been happening when nothing was happening in Saint-Cyprien on the West Bank. Perec's purpose in inventorying these moments, the infraordinary, as he labelled them, was relayed some years later in a short essay entitled Approaches to What, in which he explains what needs needed, perhaps, is finally to find our own anthropology, one that will speak about us. We will look in ourselves for what so long we've been pillaging for others. Not the exotic anymore, but the endotic. We live, true. We breathe, true. We walk, we open doors, we go down staircases. We sit at the table in order to eat. We lie down in a bed in order to sleep. How, where, when, why. For Perec, this search for a science of cognition appears through the cybernetic eye. Prosthetic vision that yearns to absorb every discernible sight into one undifferentiated depth field. Correct narrative stitches together scraps of sensibility, space and time, breaks them down into their construct micro moments, and then reassembles a kind of pixelated simulation of reality as instantaneous urban environment where each and every oscillation invokes poetic and sometimes sublime significance. My attempt behind you is doing something similar with Twitter, that being my place where I sit and I watch. It's a new window onto the world where things happen when nothing's happening. It's something which allows people to vent kind of in a cathartic manner, like shout, but it's also like just shouting into a bucket. It doesn't always like give people, it doesn't make anything, but we still don't know the potential yet about what it can do. We're still trying to work out. It's still too new, like many social media things. We're being used more by social media than we can use social media. So this is an attempt. So this is me sitting and watching Twitter and kind of writing kind of different things. This is laid out. These are double pages on the screen here. They're just a single over there, and they flick every so often. So it's like every 30 seconds is a new page. So it's a very slow piece. It's about 56 minutes, nearly an hour. So it's almost, if you watch the whole thing, like sitting down and having to read a book. So it's trying to re-engage with social media, which is usually quick and kind of snappy, that you can kind of watch quickly and ignore, whereas this you have to sit with for a while. So there's Perec's book. It's a great book. Weird little things. I use the same font and different things to make reference to the work. Okay, this is a walk which is out under the stairs, and this is an audio recording. And we're back again with Perec. The books, an attempt, and Ulysses were placed into a bag along with an audio recorder, and then this is documentation of a journey they took as I walked around Paris. Both works in the show are heavily influenced by my interests in the Europol and Situations International, both in Paris around the time of Revolution. This is my own derive, so it's kind of like going back to guided board, mapping Paris in a different way, but I'm mapping through sound, the odd route through Paris. You can kind of see the little patterns, a little drawing of where they kind of went. I'm not showing the actual map because that would be pointless. This piece only exists on the glitch app. The actual piece is just sound. So it's this constant rhythm of the books banging in my bag. So it's this odd conversation that's happening. But these days, a walk, as you're walking around the city, isn't just a walk. You're constantly being mapped by someone else. This video camera is following you constantly, and it's that weird question of why is he going in such a weird pattern, that odd double back, why did you do that? So it's become this weirdly ominous thing that a walk is no longer just a walk. And I was interested in this idea and just going back to kind of trying to take old ideas from like Situations International and trying to look at them in a new context with technologies that are happening today, and that's where that work is coming from. So we can move on. This is Intelligent Machinery, which was out in Farmley. It was myself, Sophie Lachère, and Neva Doherty running a show curated by Hilary Murray. I'm just going to start with a quote by Ballard from 71. Everything is becoming science fiction. From the margins of almost invisible literature has sprung the intact reality of the 20th century. What writers of modern science fiction invent today, you and I will do tomorrow, or more exactly do in about 10 years' time, though the gap is narrowing. And we can happily say the gap has narrowed quite a lot. We are now living in science fiction. The computers are listening, and we are being watched, of course, for our own good. The main influence on this work was, there was a few things. The main one for this series of works, called My Head is in My Hand, is based on Michael Sayre's Thumbelina, The Culture of Technology in the Millennials. I'll just go through some of So we have this kind of like screens within screens and kind of technologies now trying to become part of us. This is a quote from Michael Serres. Thumbelina opens up her computer. Even if she does not know this legend of Saint Denis, she is nonetheless beholding her own head in front of her and in her hands. It's a full head because it is enormous stock of information, and it is its programs process huge amounts of data faster than she could ever do herself. Her head has been projected before us in an objectified cognitive box. After the beheading, what is left on our shoulders? Since she no longer has to work hard to gain knowledge, it is already in front of her. She can return to the absence that hovers above her severed neck. There she will find the new genius, the inventive intelligence, and the authentic cognitive subjectivity. So this is kind of going back to the kind of pharmacon, but in a slightly more positive way, I think, where it's not so poisonous. It's more like there is potential here for now that you no longer have to think because you have information at your fingertips. Like you have Google, and that has answers. There's still like problems with, as we were talking, monetizing of things and stuff like that. But there is it's just trying to learn new ways of how to use technology for you rather than being used by technology. So I was thinking about that when I was making these works. Certain things like I'm reusing, like these are very design based. All the colors are very kind of like based. They're used like I was looking at COS clothing. They're very kind of like flashy neon stuff. But I was also thinking of like hyper real kind of horrible skin colors and stuff. Especially like the pinks of this. It's like very oozy human pink, like puss colored green, and different things like that. I was thinking about Cronenberg's kind of Long Live the New Flesh kind of thing from Videodrome as well, that kind of where technology is going inside us. And there's also, these are all kind of screens within screens. Screens are one of those things we can't really escape anymore. They're everywhere. You have your phone, I'm sitting in front of one, you're looking at one now. So it's all this layering constantly of like technology and the human touch. It's becoming this odd thing where you cannot escape. Like kids now know how to use iPads before they can write, and it's that very kind of oddly intuitive thing under technology. I should point out the show is based a bit on Alan Turing, and the whole thing's my interest was in cryptology and a bit like that. I was getting interested in kind of like Jacob Appelbaum's theories of like how to use, like be safe on the internet and Tor and different things, and how scary the world is. I was watching Citizen 4 and a few of the different documentaries, and just worrying. But we'll go back to Alan Turing, who when like in the last year that film The Imagination Game came out, and it's this kind of Hollywood glossing over like this is the happy version of Alan Turing's life. Bits of the story are a bit odd if you read the biographies and stuff like that. They have to go through they change the things so the police are trying to find out that he's gay, and whereas he openly admitted it in, when he was being interviewed, like there was no problem. So it's this weird kind of playing around. So these are portraits of Alan Turing that I have physically altered, like he was chemically castrated, as this thing of trying to, I don't know, and then trying to fix, try to make it better again, but it doesn't always work. It's like the Hollywood version. So the one on the left is where I've crumpled up a portrait of Alan Turing, and I carried it with me for a while, and I made an attempt at trying to smooth it out. It's a crumpled portrait with an attempt to restore it to its original form. Then the one on the right is a portrait left to soak in ink and water with a failed attempt to restore it to its original form. So it all got warped. It's hard to see in this, but it was all mangled and it's changed. It's also, I used the one on the right is blue, so it looked like blueprints and different things like that. It's broken into dot matrix pixels as well, so it's kind of playing around with early computer technologies. And then these are two small little portraits that I've ripped up and tried to piece back together again as best I could, and using sellotape, Raylo means. So it's this kind of this huge damage was done to this great man who like basically helped make everything we can do now happen. The computers wouldn't exist without him, like Ada Lovelace and a few other people that just get forgotten and gets glossed over with the Hollywood version of what we believe to be true. So this is an install shot of the thing. It's very, I don't know if you can see, I'll get a better picture. There's a white text running along the top of all the prints, which like, can you see? You can kind of see it going across. It's a white vinyl put onto the wall, so it becomes this hidden thing. The piece is called Cookies. It's a line from Adrian Rich's North American Time, which reads, everything we write will be used against us. And it's that thing of, I read it, I used it in a previous text where I was making layers. I tried to destroy it by layering it, but it's still there. You know this is going to happen. It's that thing of, like, as we were talking earlier, every time you click on something, you get tracked, and money kind of get monetized. Or people will start putting you on files. Like if you watched Citizen 4, it's all that scary stuff like X key score, making kind of storing large amounts of data about you, and then they can go back and then find out. And just because you happen to be in the same place as one person at the same time, they can make assumptions that you are therefore having a conversation, and then you can be indicted or end up being charged with something just because you're in the same place, and your internet data or your kind of metadata can be tracked and says, by this reason you must have done this. And it's very scary. It's kind of this odd thing that we live in a time where what you're looking at and where you go can cause you to be arrested or be charged or just stopped and questioned, which is kind of, it's very worrying, and it's in a very scary science fiction world that we live in now, because that wasn't really true, or I don't know if we just really didn't know about it in the past. But it's also that thing of, like, cookies used to be bad, used to block all your cookies on the computer, and now they've been kind of neoliberalized and made into this thing where we can help you improve your browsing data and that your experience will be much better. We can show you the books you want. This is, there was a third and final piece in this, or the fourth piece in this exhibition, was this video called Between, which is in 4 parts. There's 3 videos. There's one which is about 10 minutes long, which is a tracking shot with some text. There's this, where it's like a GIF, pretty much, where there's 2 hands, one touching and then one disappears, and you get this weird kind of like fucked up fingers thing going on, because the weird kind of touch, something's been destroyed. And then there was this, Alan Turing's head, which is missing. His head has been removed. And they were shown together. And then there's also a text piece with me reading a script, which kind of is made up of a large amount of different texts I've been reading. And it started off with the first few lines of The Imitation Game, rather than something important to tell you, but you do not understand. This is stills in between. So there's this long tracking shot, a shot in Norway, at about 6 o'clock in the morning, out of a car, because I wanted to get this kind of dark, cold setting. And it's been made blue. There's a lot of kind of clues I've kind of put into the work, like blue in the portrait also, and blue in this is methylene blue, which at one stage is was used as by the censor to destroy books. They used to pour methylene blue on the books and pulp them, so you couldn't read them again. And methylene is also the cure for arsenic, which is what Alan Turing kind of killed himself with when he stoked the apple in the arsenic and ate it. So there's this kind of, all the works are kind of connected in a really kind of odd way, hidden for me. So it's not, I don't mention this at all when you saw the show. It's kind of like, if you know certain facts, then you can start piecing things together. And this video piece is like a game. The 4 loops aren't synced, so they're constantly changing. So you never really get to experience this video the same way each time, because the text will be at a different point, the text coming up on the screen will be at a different point. So it's that kind of, like when they're trying to break the code, you're trying to break a code, and it keeps changing until you can kind of sit down and kind of piece together little bits and pieces, but it's very hard. It's kind of fun for me, annoying for the audience. Okay. This is a piece that hasn't been anything, but it is one of the last pieces I made when I was, I've just been on finished residency in Paris. So it's kind of interesting. I'm really big into books and reading. I don't like using PDFs. I can't read them, and I have no concentration for them, even though I have hundreds saved on my laptop because I can't get certain things. I also can't read French, but I was buying these anyway because they were really cheap and amazing, and I was hoping to use them for a project, and I did in the end. So this is some of these So the poem Some Leaves by John Ashbery was broken up into sections and written to the back of these books by different French authors I really like. I've read books by I've read English translations of nearly everyone, except for Cocteau. And then I left the stack of books at the top of a metro station and just took that photograph and walked off. So it's this hope that someone's going to find them and maybe use them, like someone might pick them up, like you see stacks of books around Paris all the time. I'm sure some booksellers got them and selling them somewhere, doesn't realise there's stuff written in the back. So it was this kind of this nice little thing. It's also that thing of the English invading Paris again, because it's like this weird thing of all our famous Irish writers had to leave, or they ended up in Paris at some stage and wrote the main texts there that were originally banned in Ireland. We have Beckett, Joyce, Yeats, and everyone kind of went over there. So it's just interesting. Literature has become very important to me in an odd way. It's just kind of odd for me because I wasn't really a big reader growing up. So it's all like I'm playing catch up on lots of different things. Okay. Some of this is kind of different things that have been influencing me in the last while. So this is very informal and gets. Holly Herndon, her music is fantastic. She's basically making the sound of now, which is really interesting. Her Red Bull Academy talk was very important to a lot of the work that I make for Intelligent Machinery. She's talking about how laptops and your phone, different things, are now the most intimate things in your lives. You get to hear they hear conversations you're having over Skype. They see your emails. You write all your thoughts on them. So you get this kind of thing of they end up knowing you better than you know yourself because all those little weird bits and pieces put together. But she's also very aware of like how technologies are being used against us. This is the video this is from home, and this is a video she made with MetaHaven. And so that's all like the NSA stuff falling down and streams of kind of information, and she's kind of interested in that kind of spying and like surveillance, and also how we also self-surveil ourselves. So like surveillance is a word she's using. Because it's that odd thing of we give up so much freedom for odd things like sign up for this, put your email address into that, and you get this free PDF or you get a like MP3 free, but we're giving away a lot of data about ourselves. I don't know, it's kind of interesting. She talks about a lot of kind of interesting things, and she's also developing new technology. The way she uses technology in the production of her music is very interesting. And she's always great at staring off into the future. But she's interesting in the art world ways as well, because she's very engaged in the art scene and kind of how performance is used. She's a laptop musician, but she wants to try and get away from just someone that looks like they're checking their email. So she's kind of made different ways of making it look more like a performance. So she's interesting that way. Get down to some writers who are kind of important. Dennis Cooper, this book, especially kind of The Marble Swarm, has a layer of language called the Marble Swarm that the main character has learned from his father as a way of dealing with things, kind of talking his way out of things and being very smooth and running along. But that Dennis talks a lot about how that's just the surface layer of a novel, and it has clues into ways where you can kind of get into a sub-layer in his books. There's always hidden things and lots of references to things. He's also a friend of mine, very supportive, so he's been great. And his blog's amazing for introducing me into lots of weird, interesting things in the world. And then you have Kathy Acker, who is also another great person just great for stealing. Quite like Kenneth Goldsmith, from Uwe Webb's On Creative Writing, where he talks about how he's against academic writing in one way, where you have to reference everybody, whereas he's looking at how writers should look at conceptual artists and just happily steal and rework and do different things. So I shall leave you with this thing I saw the other day on Instagram, where offline is now the new luxury, because we're all stuck online constantly, where I am anyway. I'm kind of glued to my phone and different things. So I hope that's okay.
Thanks. So, as expected, we've gone a bit over time, but if anyone wants to ask a question. We have time for a couple for any of the speakers. We won't get into it separately.
That was the walk piece.
What's the piece under the stairs?
The walk piece.
The walk piece.
Yeah.
Just the sound of the walk.
It is the sound of the walk, yeah. So it's a constant rhythm and weird things. It goes quiet and loud depending on where I am. So, but it's mostly just the books banging off each other.
I have a question maybe about the idea of the artist as a producer and then maybe a user as well, or how far maybe that could go. Like you mentioned, activity kind of being monitored and suspicious, like if you just do certain things and taking an odd walk or lots of, how far would you ever go far in that and place yourself in some kind of suspicious scenario? Or do you need to keep that gap, that distance?
I think it's all kind of new at the moment, all this work's very different to what I was previously doing. This kind of expanded more. I actually had a lot of time to work on things for the first time, so everything was more time being spent. But no, it'd be interesting. Yeah. God, I can't remember the French, really famous female artist who has many books, where she gets people to follow her or had Paul Auster write what she's going to do, Sophie Calle there. But yeah, no, it'd be interesting. She's done it really well, and it's just trying to work out ways of doing it. Or not really redoing it, because it kind of she's done it really well, but like if you could do it in an odd, like technological way or different things, I don't know. You spend some time kind of trying to work out new ways. I'm working on a portrait for the portrait awards thing coming up, where it's basically just I'm collecting all the data I can find on myself, and I'm going to just basically show that on a little hard drive. And it would just be the hard drive sitting there, and that would be me. So it's this odd portrait that's very inaccessible, but everything, a version of me is there. There's a really great, there's two really great books by Edward Luff, who's a French photographer and writer. One was called Suicide, talks about his friend who killed himself, and the other's called Autoportrait, where he's just describing himself, but it's in very like short sentences, like I lived in Algiers for a year. I wore Comme des Garçons to perfume. I wore a white shirt every day. I read this book, and this book, and it's very interesting that you can actually build a picture of someone through that very basic data. But it's also that evil thing of that's how the NSA are kind of looking at us, hello NSA, and building like profiles in an odd way of metadata through that way. So it's that odd thing of. It's like in reality, not reality bites, brain's gone dead, John Cusack film in the record store, High Fidelity, where he's talking about describing yourself as the things you like the music and films and books you've read, probably are easier to kind of make people understand who you are. And it's like when you look at profiles online, as we were looking at Facebook, your likes and stuff build up an idea of who you are. It's really interesting with Facebook and things, and like even just saying what you like and how you're linked in with people in odd ways like that. You can kind of build a false version of yourself if you're thinking about it more. And I think some people are. There's like virtual people who are kind of they're not really real. So there's like ways of kind of maybe using that as making an artwork, but it becomes this kind of hard thing to kind of then work out how to show that, because it could just be a profile, but it's very hard to go, well, this, you kind of give the game away if you explain what you've done. Or it's that fun thing of like, I like going into Amazon and just searching for random things I'm not interested in, just to completely confuse the algorithms and stuff like that. So you get these weird kind of, your search engines are doing odd stuff. But I don't know if that's an artwork or just me being playing games. It's just, but these are all things I'm just doing on my own, so I don't really know how to articulate them as an artwork.
There's a very interesting philosophical problem around Amazon profiling, which you can, in terms of potentiality. So in one way, Amazon is restricting what your potentiality is by saying this is what you like, and that your possibility of choosing things that are outside of your profile.
It gets very small because it keeps building down into a pyramid shape. Yeah, it's it's interesting because I've noticed like I find more things from other places, like usually from reading other books or reading old literature magazines and stuff. I'm really interested in like 60s experimental writing, and then the 70s, and a lot of kind of other things have been pointing back to kind of like going back to the Toulouse and Guattari, but also looking at like accelerationism, which is quite interesting, and how that's already kind of over now, but it's still kind of up in the air, because you have to be it's very trying to keep up with all like the philosophical ideas going on in sociology. It's like it's a full-time job, so I'm more dabbling into that and trying to make art at the same time is very hard. So it's I'm very interested in it. I'm kind of trying to keep up with it. Like last night I was looking at Mohammed Salameh's new super community post about the machines and artworks, which kind of bits I was like, ooh, that's interesting, and then others I wanted to slap him because it was very it's very interesting, but it's really hard to kind of keep up with all the reading. I'm really interested in xenofeminism as well at the moment. Helen Hester and Amy Ireland's kind of new project on the new kind of cyberfeminism, technofeminism thing. So also last night I was trying to hack or break the code. They put up an English version of the book that's being written. So hopefully someone has sent me the password. Because I have no idea. I'm only like playing it at very low levels, but I know enough to know that I'm probably like end up on some watch list.
So as an artist, do you see yourself maybe in the position of the hacker? Looking for the secret codes? Or?
No, I don't know, a hacker. I've always kind of gone back to thinking in like terms of hip hop and DJing, because that's kind of what I started doing years ago. And it's that odd thing of like, there was Double D and Steinsky put out the lessons early on where they cut up all the hip hop tracks and put them together to make this thing. So it made this one new piece by putting odd things together. But it's also that fun thing of like, I used to think of my artwork because I do a lot of like mangling different things together in one way. It's like when you put two records on that are from two different times, like you can have a post-punk record and some new like space disco track. And it's sometimes where they don't fit properly in the weird bumping together, you can kind of get interesting ideas about like what's going on, because it's this new thing, this new hybrid. Sometimes uncomfortable things are more interesting than like the really smooth, exciting kind of, oh, this is really slick looking, because there's lots of really slick looking. It's very easy to do that. Like photography is now, I find it very hard to look at photography and think of it in a serious manner. Some people, it's to do with this weird intention, because it's so easy for everyone just to go and snap, 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 and kind of Instagram does nice tricks and filters that you couldn't do, or you had to use Holger cameras and stuff. So it's kind of odd. I get oddly obsessed with different things and do a lot of research, but it's not in a very academic way. It's more in like a fanboy type of way, where like try and grab as much information as possible about something and keep that there. There's a really nice kind of idea from Robert Bresson's book on cinematography, where he's talking about when you're working with something that you really have to love the subject, and that's what I kind of am trying to do. So you have to kind of fall for this thing and be obsessed with it, and that's where I'm trying to do things at the moment, which is very hard. So hopefully that makes some sense.